As a principal with FMI, Jay Bowman assists a broad range of stakeholders in the construction industry, from program managers and general contractors to specialty trades and material producers, with the identification and assessment of the risks influencing the strategic and tactical decisions they face. In this role, Jay's primary responsibilities include research design and interpretation based on developing an understanding of the context within which these organizations operate. These draw upon many of the research services he oversees, including market sizing and forecasting, buying practices and preferences, and competitive behaviors and response. Publications to Jay's credit include FMI's annual U.S. Market Construction Overview, Influencers in Construction, Assessing Alternatives, Should We Expand the Business, Incorporating Customer Perceptions in Strategy Development, and Conditions Ripe for Increased Use of Program Management. Jay earned his MBA degree from East Carolina University. He received undergraduate degrees from the University of Georgia in Risk Management and Insurance. Prior to joining FMI, he worked with Aon Risk Services in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm honored today to introduce you to Jay Bowman from FMI. Take it away, Jay.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, Chicagoland AGC, for the opportunity to speak with you today and just share a little bit of the outlook that we at FMI have on the market, particularly in this post-pandemic world. What will things look like as we think about all the things that occurred over the last, say, 6 months to 9 months, and how that's reimagining really what the future of our industry may look like. Some things stay the same and some things are really ripe for significant change, and we're really happy to have this chance to really share this with you. So with that in mind, it seems that in these crazy days we find wisdom in rather strange places. One of the things early on that I was reminded of was the song Tom Sawyer by the band Rush, and particularly the lyric or the line from the song that says, "Changes aren't permanent, but change is." And that was really helpful for me because I think for a lot of us, yes, this has been a very major disruption, not only to our businesses and our professional lives, but our personal lives as well. I have 3 teenage daughters, and starting in March, going to school from home and everything else. It was a lot of new things to become accustomed to, but I was drawn to this song because it really helped me be reminded of the fact that this isn't the first major disruption that we've been through. We've been through a lot of these changes in our industry. And so it's really important for us to just remember, well, what did we learn from past disruptions or past recessions that we've been through? And how did we respond? What were the right things we did? What were perhaps some of the wrong things we did? And also, I would say that this isn't necessarily a time to be too, I'll say, scared. I actually reminded of a gentleman by the name of Pierre Wack. He was a executive with Royal Dutch Shell back in the 1970s and was actually considered to be one of the early contributors to scenario planning from a business perspective. And to paraphrase really his comments about times like this was that when things are extremely uncertain, that's when really the greatest opportunity for entrepreneurial potential exists, meaning that this is really the time to create some competitive advantage and really rethink how we do things as an organization, as an industry. So again, I don't think it's necessarily a time to panic. It's a time to really reconsider how we might be approaching things. So with that said, there's really 3 things that I would love for you to take away from the time that we have here together. The first one being that, regardless of what the economy looks like, and this is a lesson that I've seen over and over again in the last several recessions that we've been through as an industry, is this concept that, bull markets and bear markets coexist at all times. Meaning, even when we have periods of sustained growth, there are going to be some markets or geographies and some segments or types of construction that are going to be in decline. Similarly, when there are markets that are in decline during a recessionary period, there's still other segments and markets that will increase or sort of defy the overall trajectory. I mean, if you think about the last recession, and if we say for our industry, that period was roughly 5 years, from a peak in 2006 to the trough in 2011, overall construction spending in the US dropped 35% during that 5-year period. But of the 19 segments that FMI tracks, about 9 of those actually grew during that 5-year period. And power construction grew by over 80% during that 5-year period. And it wasn't just the, I'll say the public sectors. Healthcare grew during that time. Manufacturing actually grew during the last recession. So just be reminded that there will be opportunities. There are growth markets, regardless of what we're preparing for over the next several years as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The second thing, and I think this is a concept that we really have to be paying a lot more attention to. It was actually an idea that I was really starting to think about a couple of years ago, but now with everything being accelerated through the changes of the pandemic, it's just kind of front and center all over again. And that is that regardless of what the forecast may look like, meaning up, down, sideways, you name it, that composition is key, meaning what makes up that spending is something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. So for example, if we think of commercial construction, and if we say that overall commercial construction, which includes both retail and distribution centers, with all the growth that we've seen in e-commerce, you could say, well, the traditional retail is actually down, but distribution is up. So you could get a mixed view of commercial. Similarly with size of projects, I mean, we saw a tremendous amount of growth over the last 10 years in our industry. But if you think that in the last couple of years, roughly a third of starts was really represented by mega projects or projects valued over $1 billion. So really paying attention to that composition of what type of projects are likely to come, who are the owners of those projects, what do they look like, the characteristics, is another thing to really be paying attention to understand, well, what do those opportunities look like for me specifically? And then last one is really putting those two together, whether there's growth opportunities or that composition, is really asking the question about what is our identity as an organization? What really defines what we sell and what our customers are buying from us? And being able to have a clear indication of that true identity, of really understanding what is my value proposition, will really serve you tremendously as you consider, what are those pivot opportunities for us going forward. So those three things, again, remaining optimistic that there are opportunities, there are growth markets or bull markets to be found even in a bear economy, keeping your eye on market composition, and then really asking yourself that question about alignment, about, what is my value proposition? What is my identity? Those three things will really serve you well as we kind of start to navigate the next 2 years. So let's talk about a little about where we are. So we'll start off nationally, but obviously we've been through an absolutely unprecedented sort of velocity of change here in the last several months. And if you look at where we were from a GDP perspective in the second quarter of this year, down 33%. I mean, to put that in perspective, that's roughly 4 to 5 times greater than any other single quarter decline in GDP. So that kind of shock to the system was just, again, one of those things that it's hard to wrap our minds around. But then simultaneously in the third quarter, we saw GDP increase by roughly 35%. Now, the thing that I would say to caution you when you see something like this is that second quarter does not represent the recession, meaning that we're not just totally out of this. Our industry typically lags the overall industry by roughly 1.5 years to 2 years. So we don't really feel that impact until later on. However, I think there's a lot of good news in this, in the sense that because of the rebound that we've seen, what that means to us from a recessionary period for our industry is it should be, more, I'll say, shallower, and it shouldn't be as protracted. So we're not necessarily looking at another great recession from where we stand today. And consider the fact that, we've added over half the private sector jobs that we lost at the onset of the recession, or excuse me, of the pandemic. that the manufacturing aspects of our country as measured by the PMI is at an 18-month high. Home sales are up almost 25%. And even retail sales, which are probably one of the best indicators of economic activity, is up 4% over the prior peak. So again, we do think that the economy should return and should do well. Be prepared that construction, we do lag, but that again, these are positive signs that it won't be a return to the 2008 that we would all like to forget. So what I'm sharing with you though is what we know of as of today, right? Things can change quickly, as we all saw during the months of February and March and April of this year. So since I can't be in your organizations every single day, what would be the things that I would watch for just to be ready in case there are certain changes? And so I typically think about different economic indicators that I might look at, and I would bucket them as overrated versus underrated. Now, when I say overrated, I don't mean that these are bad economic indicators. I just want you to be aware of the limitations they may have. And what would be the things that I would recommend that you and your management team and leadership team be thinking about and watching on a more regular basis? So I know I just showed you GDP, and GDP does give us a very good indication of where we've been, but the problem is exactly that. GDP is a backward-looking statistic. It only comes out quarterly, so it's really too infrequent, if you will, for really making planning decisions. Plus, it's subject to revision. We see GDP projections be revised up and revised down. Now, one of my favorites, and this has nothing to do with the fact that I'm talking to the Chicagoland AGC, is the Chicago Fed National Activity Index. This is actually probably one of my favorite indicators. Why? Because it makes it easy for me. It essentially takes 85 other of the most important economic indicators and compiles them into a single statistic. So I don't have to worry about trying to interpret 85 different points of data. I can just look at it. It's not sentiment based, meaning it's just based on fact. It's not what people feel or what they think. It's truly kind of what the data is telling us. And more importantly, it has a very strong correlation to future GDP, meaning this is a forward-looking indicator, in my opinion. And it comes out very frequently. You can download it for free off of the Chicago Fed's website. But that would be one that I would say, number one, you should be watching on a regular basis. This recession was also, or this pandemic was one that was noted by the change in employment. The loss of jobs, particularly in the service sector, is really what got us to that minus 33% GDP for the second quarter. Now, most of the employment statistics that you'll see published are based on the current employment statistics. Now, that is a good indicator. However, it only measures people on official payrolls. So all the gig economy that we have going on now, whether it's the Uber driver, someone starting a business from home, from an internet-based type of thing or whatever, it misses those people. So I actually think the current population survey is actually a better indicator because it really shows people who are working. They just may not necessarily be on an official employer's payroll. As I also mentioned, from a sentiment perspective, consumer confidence is really just that. It's just a sentiment. It's not really based on any hard data. It's just how people feel. Whereas retail sales, as I showed you on the prior slide, that actually has a much stronger, say, relationship with what's truly going on because it's truly data-based. And when you think that over 2/3 of our economy is driven by consumer activity, this is probably one of the best ones next to population that you can look at as the closest correlation to construction activity. And then last, just like on the last slide from a manufacturing perspective, rather than looking at the durable goods orders, that PMI or Purchasing Managers Index is an excellent one to look at. So I would definitely have these four: the Chicago Fed National Activity Index, the current population survey, retail sales, and the PMI sort of in my Rolodex or in my folder of things I'm going to look at on a regular basis to really understand where things are going from a general economic perspective. And looking at that is important because I mentioned our industry typically lags the overall economy by roughly a year and a half to 2 years. So just to illustrate this point, This chart, I'm just showing you the rough volume of construction spending in this country on a monthly basis. It's really hard to get the actual numbers. So this kind of gives you a rough feel for where it was. And the orange box is just showing you what the federal government defined as the official Great Recession. So it was about a year and a half long, starting in December of 2007 and officially ending in June of 2009. Now, the way we measure a recession, as you'll recall, is we have to have 2 quarters of negative GDP before we will, or the government will officially announce the start of a recession. Likewise, we have to have 2 consecutive quarters of positive GDP before the government will announce an end to a recession. So if we take that, we actually would say we would have to shift that back to really understand what the true economy was doing. So if we do that and we push that back, say 2 quarters, then this orange dotted line would say that really the economy started to say improve or turn somewhere at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009. Yet if you look at construction activity in terms of the gray bars here, we didn't hit our trough or the very bottom point until February of 2011. So we're talking, over 2 years, before we really hit the bottom. Now that was a much different recession than what I think we would expect this time around, but we've seen this pattern over and over and over again. So again, don't mistake, the improvement in the GDP in the third quarter to be signifying the end of the recession. We still have some things to be prepared for going forward. Now, one of the characteristics of this recession that I think is important to keep in mind that will be much more pronounced this time around than perhaps we've seen in prior recessions is that of place, meaning where you are will have an outsized impact on whether you think there was a very brief recession or no recession at all to a much more protracted recession. And so one of the things that we've looked at is, well, based on how different states are or were going into this, meaning the rate of infections, what was the response of the local and state governments in terms of stay-at-home orders, and what businesses were considered to be, essential versus non-essential, as well as just the financial situation that these different states found themselves in, or cities. Did they have a rainy day fund, or did they have budget issues? Which of these states would we say are a higher risk of this recession being longer, deeper, et cetera? And so this map just shows you that those that are shaded red are those that would be at a higher risk. Now, I'm not saying that this means this is an absolute that these things will happen. It's just saying that the risk is higher. That's why I would look at those 4 indicators that I shared earlier, plus those that might be local to your business, to really understand, what should I really be preparing for over the next couple of years. Now, what could change this? Well, part of that is they've started, talking again, now that the election is behind us, or we think it's behind us, talking more about stimulus. That would have a major impact on changing perhaps what this map looks like. Because the biggest difference that we saw in the prior stimulus packages, whether they were from the Democrat plan or the Republican plan, was that the Democrat plan had more money in there for state and local relief. So assuming where we are now, a new stimulus package would probably have that, which would really benefit those states in the sort of red and orange. Again, I would keep an eye on that, kind of see where things are going. I do expect some stimulus to be passed, which would reduce some of this risk, but it is something to be, kind of sober-minded about. Now, that being said, let's just talk about construction overall. Obviously, Chicagoland AGC, unfortunately, you're sitting in one of those red states. But let's keep one thing in mind. When we think about construction in this country, roughly the top 10 metropolitan markets, there's over 380 metropolitan markets in this country. Roughly the top 10 represent $1 in $3 of construction spending. Chicago metropolitan market is the 5th largest construction market in the entire country. So we're already talking about a huge base. Chicago's where the amount of construction spending in the Chicago metro area is larger than some states. So there's still a lot of activity. So even if we're looking at a decline, it's still a very, very large market. And as you consider that, and I do think that the trend towards urbanization, even though we do have people moving out of the urban core, we don't necessarily see everybody wholesale moving to Santa Fe or to Boise, Idaho. It's more moving to the suburban areas or suburban markets. My expectation is that these markets will continue to be sort of the largest construction markets going forward. And frankly, I think more and more urbanization, they will become a larger and larger share of construction spending over time. That's been the natural sort of progression or trajectory. So while we do see some of those risks, this is a way to kind of look at it as a positive, but also keep in mind that as other firms and other markets are looking to avoid either downturns in their own markets or to continue to grow, where are they likely to go? And you see these big orange bubbles, which represent these big markets. They're likely to attract more and more competition. So a good way to be thinking about that as well. What is that positive? What's the potential challenges? Chicago being in one of those markets that may be more challenged from a risk perspective, but still remains one of the largest construction markets in our country. So let's talk about what that outlook then for the Chicagoland area looks like. So I've defined this as the Chicago metropolitan statistical area, which includes Naperville, Elgin, parts of Northwest Indiana, and Southeast Wisconsin. And so if we look at over time, since 2011 was really the trough, if you will, where we were prior, total construction spending in the Chicago MSA was roughly about $20 billion. Then you get to 2019, we've peaked at roughly $32 billion. And when you look at sort of what we're seeing in terms of the overall, say, construction trend, you can see that 2-year down cycle that I was mentioning, where 2022 looks to be, as we know today, the rough sort of, I'll say, bottom, if you will, that orange line. That's really kind of what we're projecting. If things were really to turn and get much better, we have a best case scenario, and then we actually have a worst case scenario as well. I really don't think that that's likely to occur, but I think it's good to think about these two things. But now, if you think about this, what we're looking at in terms of the outlook for the Chicagoland area, I think this is something positive to think about. Now, while we are looking at a decline of say roughly in the neighborhood of 10% or so over the next couple of years, if you compare that to the U.S. overall, that's actually not as bad a decline. Overall construction spending in the U.S. is actually expected to decline by 15% over the next 2 years. So a 10% decline in Chicago is, I'm not saying that's great. No one's happy about a 10% decline, but it's less than what we're seeing from the U.S. overall. And also a 10% decline really puts us kind of squarely in what a normal recession looks like. What is the normal decline during a typical recession in the construction industry? So kind of what we're looking at, it's sort of, we'll be back around sort of 2015 levels for a while before roughly sometime around the 22, 23 time period, we should begin to see growth again in the marketplace. Now, another way to think about this, though, is that nobody chases 100% of the market. So we have to think about this from an industry perspective or from a segment perspective. Now, this is some research that came from Oxford Economics and McKinsey. I thought was really helpful to consider. And essentially, they're looking at various industries and saying, well, what's the soonest that this industry may recover, meaning to pre-pandemic levels? And what's the latest? So the length of the bar here, just on the left-hand side of the bar, that would be the earliest that they're projecting that these industries might recover under a virus-contained scenario. And on the right-hand side of the bar, that would be more the longer time period and when it might recover under more of a muted recovery. And so if you look at the first two, arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation, and food services, industries that largely require people to be physically present, right? So we think about movie theaters, we think about hotels, restaurants, bars, etc. you can see that the earliest that they're projecting a recovery is actually not until 2024. So even though we're saying that total construction spending in the Chicagoland area looks to hit its sort of trough or bottom in 22, if I'm talking specifically about arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services, that may be a much longer recovery. It might be 2025, again, using that same year and a half, 2-year delay before we would really see an improvement in construction activity. Whereas others, like healthcare and social assistance at the bottom, we're actually seeing those starting to actually come back faster. They took a major hit early in the recession, but now we're starting to see those come back with some certain activities. So we can see that actually recover sooner rather than later. And then some of these I think is important to keep in mind, whether it's transportation and warehousing or manufacturing, because the bar is so long. I think it's just they're combining a couple of different things in there. So for example, on the transportation and warehousing, yes, transportation like transit systems probably have a longer period before they recover, but warehousing, distribution centers, cold storage, et cetera, we haven't even seen a decline in those activities. So that's part why we're seeing some of those long bars. But I would use this as a way to kind of think about how might different industries that I might be serving from a construction perspective, what's the outlook for those? So if we then look at that in terms of actual construction spend, again, in the Chicagoland area, how does that play out from a construction perspective? So in this chart, all you're looking at is on the x-axis or the horizontal axis is what is the estimated construction spending in 2020 for each of these different segments that FMI tracks. So for example, on the far right-hand side of the, far right-hand side of the chart, single family being the largest segment at roughly say $4.5 billion. And then on the far left-hand side, religious, which includes churches, synagogues, mosques, being the smallest at under $500 million, probably even closer to $100 million in construction spending. On the vertical axis or the y-axis is what is the current forecast growth in construction spending in each of these segments. So just like on the prior slide where we're showing that the amusement and arts and entertainment, lodging, et cetera, doesn't look to recover until from an industry perspective until at least 2024. That's sort of reflected in this construction spending. So you see lodging, amusement, and recreation over the 5-year period forecast to decline by 6% compounded annually over that entire forecast period. Office and commercial, sort of the same thing. But remember what I said earlier, one of the lessons that composition, because commercial here includes traditional retail, but it also includes logistics, distribution centers, cold storage, et cetera. If I were to separate those, I would actually see that distribution piece being a very positive side. And then you can see some of those other ones that look to be doing well over the next several years, manufacturing, educational, some of those are actually in the positive growth over the next couple of years. But also I would be thinking about this in terms of 2 cycles that I may be preparing for. So the next 2 years is a down cycle, and potentially the latter 2 years is an up cycle. But it gives you an idea of where some of the construction spending looks to be by these different segments over the next several years. So you can begin to plan to say, well, where might I be able to pivot? Where might be some of those opportunities for me? So as I mentioned, there are bear markets in every bull market, and there's bull markets in every bear market. So who are some of those bulls and bears this time around? Well, manufacturing, but particularly in the life sciences space, there's tremendous growth there that we see continuing going on. Distribution, we've had actually more, I'll say, growth in e-commerce over the last 3 months than we did in the last 10 years combined. This is just the way things are headed. I think it's something the fact that 1 out of every $5 is now spent online. So we'll continue to see a lot of that. Cold storage in particular is one of the strongest growing aspects of that, because from a technology perspective, we've added the other half of the consumer market by being able to do same-day delivery with food and foodstuffs. Data center construction continues to grow at just an incredible pace. And with the advent of 5G, that additional amount, whether it's in the traditional large hyperscale or even now in these edge facilities, we'll see a ton of activity there. And then even on the heavy civil side, particularly around intelligent transportation systems, we haven't raised the federal gas tax in almost 30 years, 1993 being the last. Yet we still have tremendous needs on our road infrastructure. And yet, how are we going to raise the funds necessary to continue to pay for that, particularly as vehicles become more fuel efficient? We're seeing more and more electric vehicles. So intelligent transportation systems, whether through electronic tolling or otherwise, will be a really large growth market opportunity we see over the next several years as well. These are just a couple of those, but these are ones that we would expect, potentially double-digit growth over the next several years. Likewise, those that, again, that we don't see a lot of opportunity over the next several years, not saying that there won't be projects, but not the type of growth, but probably be more muted. Obviously, lodging, traditional commercial construction, amusement and recreation, and office. But I will say about office, one of the things that's interesting there is that we do need to be rethinking the space from an office perspective. So while overall office construction could be down, some of the tenant improvement work to rearrange space, to bring all of the space that visitors to an office building may be coming in contact with, whether it's conference rooms, executive offices, et cetera, may be brought to the front while everything else is pushed to the back to limit the amount of exposure visitors would have to the employees in those offices. So again, thinking about some of these, there's plenty of others that we can discuss if you wish. These are some of the big ones that I would just point out. So as we close, one of my favorite quotes, and it's been attributed to Mark Twain and others. I'm not really sure if anyone knows who it's attributed to, but I always love it, is this orange one up here. It's not what you don't know that gets most people in trouble. It's what you know for certain that just ain't so. And the reason I like that quote is because, particularly given this pandemic, and everything that we've gone through, whether it's remote working, is doing things like this in Zoom or WebEx or Teams, or take your favorite pick of online platforms, is all the things that we considered to be impractical, perhaps pre-pandemic, we're really challenging that to say, well, are these things now truly practical? Are there really different ways that we can do things? So I would be asking yourself, I'd be asking the people in your organization, having conversations around a couple of different areas. And these aren't all the questions I'd be thinking about, but they're ones from a strategic standpoint I absolutely would be considering now. The first one being that, with social distancing giving way to community distancing, at least near term. Again, I'm not saying that people are moving from Chicago to necessarily Boise in rapid numbers, but moving out to the suburban areas. How does that change competition when I think of the difference between who can compete on a 30-story building versus a 3-story building? But how does it just change the dynamic of how work is done, who owners are, et cetera, if we do have more of a, I'll say, the suburban renaissance? Also, with just the technology itself, how it's not only democratizing the things that we can do, but even diminishing in some cases specialization, whether it's the use of drone technology or the robotics, but also how it's doing this, in the sense of how many people I can get in touch with now electronically, where perhaps before I thought what had to be physical interaction. Dual purposing, thinking about buildings differently. I do think from a capital investment perspective, building owners, infrastructure owners, et cetera, are really going to be, asking questions about, well, how do I get more out of these facilities than just what it's initially designed to do? How can I have multiple ways to use this space in a way that makes, more opportunities? And then last, just procurement in the age of e-commerce, with less and less human interaction, sometimes more and more electronic, and particularly with the Generation Z coming up, the oldest ones really coming out of college about right now, who are the really true first digital natives. How might that change the way we think about the way our services are procured going forward? But these are just some of those questions that I would be dealing with from a strategic standpoint. Again, really thinking about how has this changed? And I would just end with the 3 points I made earlier, is that there are always going to be opportunities, regardless of what the market may look like. It's being able to identify those that will be key. But even if you're in a market that you say, well, we haven't really been impacted, really consider that composition. How might really either who the customer is, what is being requested, how those things may be changing. And then as you start to think through some of these questions and some of the strategic implications they are, really asking the question, what kind of firm are we? What truly are we selling? But having these things will really put you in a position to succeed over the next couple of years. Now, everything that I've talked about here is really taken from a lot of our different sources. You can download most of these, if not all of them, for free off the FMI website. And we'll make this presentation available to everyone as well. And again, we really appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts. And I will turn it back over to Tom. Thank you very much.